In the pages that we've been circulating with the help of David, we're on page 356, and we're studying Megilat Ruth, its relationship to Shavuot, and specifically the Gerus of Ruth. And this is a fascinating chapter in Jewish history, and it touches on the entire structure of Torah Shebaal Peh and how we rely on the transmission of the oral law. We're going to try to address the following questions. Number one, what was the issue about David HaMelech, whether David HaMelech could enter the Kahal or not? The Gemara, as we'll soon see, records a debate between Doeg Hadomi and Avner, who's the Sar Tzava at the time of Melech Shaul, and this was a long debate back and forth, complicated arguments, ahin and here, and we want to study that. What was at stake over here? And also, one wonders because Boaz, way back when he married Ruth, he publicized the fact that she was Muteris Lakal. And now we find that generations later, when David is around, they sort of kick up the dust and re-examine the issue of the status of David HaMelech. I mean, why wasn't it enough that Boaz would already declare publicly in front of 10 men, and Chazal say that these were the leaders of the entire Bezdin? Why did he feel compelled to, generations later, reopen the can of worms here with regard to the issue of Moavi velo Moaviyah? And furthermore, what really is the difference between a Moavi and a Moaviyah, between the male members who are excluded from Kol and the female members who can be accepted through Gerus? We'd also like to understand why is it that Megilat Ruth played such a major role as a midig b'chol tfutzas Yisrael on Chag HaShavuos. So in preparation for Chag HaShavuos, what's the role of Megilat Ruth? Chazal and the Medrash already asked why Shmuel Hanavi, who authored Megilat Ruth, insisted on incorporating it into Tanakh. We don't find too many halachic chidushim in Megilat Ruth. It's mostly a long story, some of which is sad. Why is it connected? How is it connected to Chag HaShavuos? And a more general question about Chag HaShavuos is that of the three regalim, Shavuos is the only one whose date, its precise date, is very ambiguous in the Torah. The other regalim, the Torah explicitly mentions it's the 15th of Nisan for Pesach, 15th of Tishrei for Sukkot, but here it's Usfartem Lachem Imachar Shabbos, count 50 days and sanctify the 50th day. No precise date in a month. The Gemara says Rosh Hashanah, that Shavuos could be Chal on the 5th of Sivan, on the 6th of Sivan, on the 7th of Sivan. What's that all about? Now, the Medrash says, and you'll see it here in footnote number 2, Shal Rabbi Zera, Megilah Zu, Ein Ba Limud Halachos, Ein Ba Lo Tuma, Lo Tara, Lo Iser, Lo Heter, Lo Menichtava. The Medrash codifies, or shall we say, testifies to the fact that Rabbi Zeira was perplexed about why Megilat Ruth is so critical. Why is it incorporated into the 24 books of the Tanakh? And we see in the Gemara in Yevamos, that's going to be our main sugya for today. Ayin Vav, Amid Beis, recently learned in the Daf Yomi, that during the days of the Shoftim, And specifically in the generation of Boaz, this question came up, a suffix about the Yichus and the Mishpach of David HaMelech. Would David HaMelech be allowed to enter into the Kol? Would he not? And the whole suffix was based on the pasuk in Kitetse, Lo Yavo Amoni Umoavi B'Kal Hashem. We are not makabel gerim from Ammon and Moab. And therefore Ruth, who is a Moaviyah, could not enter into Klal Yisrael if we assume that she comes under this declaration of Lo Yavo B'Kal Hashem. And this was the suffix that was raised at the time that David HaMelech, as we'll see, stepped forward and volunteered to try to contest with Goliath. Let's backtrack a little. David HaMelech's father was Yishai. And Chazal tell us that Yishai was married to a certain woman by the name of Nitzvas Bas Adil. In any event, we don't have to memorize the name, but they had a number of children. And at some point, there was a shmua going around, a very strong rumor, that this family cannot be accepted into Klal Yisrael because the roots of this family are in Ruth HaMoaviyah, about whom the Torah says, Lo Yavo Amoni Umoavi B'Kal Hashem. At that point in time, the halacha, the principle of Moavi v'lo Moaviyah, was not accepted. It was questioned. It was a matter of ambiguity, a lack of clarity, and even contention and debate. But Yishai was worried. His fear was that all of his children would be disqualified from entering into Klal Yisrael. And therefore, he took upon himself a personal isur not to have relations with his wife, Nitzeves. And he wouldn't have any more children. The Chazal tell us he was poresh from her for 3 years. And Yishai said that in the worst case scenario, if they passel my children, I will activate the ruling of Rabbi Tarfon, which is codified in Kiddushin Samach Tes as Yecholim Mamzerim Lihitoy. How would he be Mitayr his children? The truth be told, that if you activate the principle of Rabbi Tarfon, you cannot be Mitayr a Mamzer, but you can be Mitayr the Mamzer's children. So Yishai is already concerned about his grandchildren, the next generation. How does he apply the principle of Rabbi Tarfon? He's going to marry a Shifcha Knainis. Now, if we assume that Yishai, as a descendant of Moab, is excluded from Kahal Yisrael, then at least according to one opinion, that's Rabbi Tarfon, he's allowed to marry a Shifcha Knainis. Now, once he marries a Shifcha Knainis, the halacha is that the offspring from a Shifcha Knainis are avodim, meaning their yichus is to the mother, which would mean that the owner, the master who owns the Eved could be Meshachar the Eved, and that's a get shichur which generates gerus. And now the ger is a regular ger. He's not considered a mamzer. The mamzeris was lost and replaced by his status as a ben of a shivcha. So the mamzer could marry a shivcha knanis, again according to that Mandi Omar. Then he gives a get shikha to the shivcha knanis after he has children. And those children become avodim, and with the shikha of those avodim, they become gerim, gemurim, without the stigma of mamzeris. So Yishai said in his heart, you know what? For the sake of my future children, meaning the next generation of children, I'm going to have this situation in which there's going to be a marriage to a shifcha knanis. Now, assuming that Yishai, is excluded from Kol, based on the fact that he's a descendant of Ruth, and Akol Holech HaChaposel, but that's not for us now. Therefore, he could marry a shivcha knanis according to Rabbi Tarfon, and his child, will not be a mamzer. So although those children that he already had from his Jewish wife, right? What was her name again? Nitzeves. Those children are mamzerim. If you assume that a descendant of a Moaviyah is psul kol. Again, it's not exactly a mamzer in the technical sense, but has the same status as a mamzer, meaning psul kol. Those children he can't be mitayer, but they could be mitayer their children, Yishai's grandchildren, through this marriage to a shivcha knanis. Now, when Yishai goes ahead and marries a shivcha knanis, she is very loyal to her mistress, I guess you call it, meaning to Nitzeves, the wife of Yishai, and she's absolutely convinced that Moavi v'lo Moavis, and therefore there's no need for Yishai to marry her. He's not psulei kol. Again, although that halacha was questioned, but she was absolutely convinced. So therefore, she wants to reinstate the marriage between Yishai and Nitzeves, a great tzaddikus. This may be the most famous shivcha knanis in all of Jewish history. And she does an action which is very similar to that of Rachel Imenu. She has simonim, which were secret passwords that were given to her by Yishai, and she passes them on to Nitzeves. As a result of that relationship that Nitzeves has with Yishai, David HaMelech is born. So in a funny sort of sense, that shivcha knanis, the so to speak wife of Yishai, was responsible for the birth of David. David was born not to her, but to Nitzeves. We don't know her name. Okay. Now we're on page 359, and David HaMelech is volunteering to go out to battle against Goliath. And if you see footnote number 15, Shmuel Aleph, Perek Yud Zayin, the pasuk records that Shaul HaMelech confers with his Sar Tzava Avner, and he asks him, Ben mi zeh hanar? Again, if I had a whiteboard, I would write the word na'ar on the whiteboard. So if you have a pen and paper, write the word na'ar in big letters. The Gemara says the following: Shaul did not know, he did not recognize David. After all, you'll see in footnote number 16 that in an earlier chapter in Shmuel Aleph, namely chapter 16, David HaMelech is recorded as saying, "Vayaveu mi'od vayhilo nosei keleh." When Shaul HaMelech suffered from this ruach ra, I guess you'd call it depression, David HaMelech would play music for him, and that instrumental music brought Shaul out of depression. And therefore Shaul loved him very much and appointed him as his chief Nosei Kelim. So the Gemara says you have to be careful about reading the language of Shaul's question. When he addressed Avner, he didn't ask, who is this fellow? For sure, Shaul HaMelech knew it was David. He asked, Ben Mizehana. Apparently he was unaware of David's yichus. Where was he coming from? And basically, the Gemara says, this also makes no sense, because Yishai was one of the great sarim in the kingdom of Shaul. Yishai was a sar over 600,000 Jews. No question that Shaul had no doubts about who Yishai was. But the Gemara answers that David was already feeling, based on what Shmuel had told him after Milchemes HaMolek, which was a fiasco, that the Malchus was going to be ripped away from him. Shaul knew that. And he was afraid that this fellow David, the son of Yishai, was going to take over the Malchus. So Shaul began to get quite fearful, because he saw that this David is no regular guy. I mean, he had known him as an instrumentalist, but now he is the one Jew who volunteers to go out there and tackle Goliath. Maybe he's the one who's going to take away the Malchus from me, as Shmuel had already foretold. So when Shaul says, Ben mi hanar, he wasn't asking about the father of David. He knew the father of David, but he was asking about the entire development and the origin of the family, going back to the roots. Is David HaMelech mizera melucha? He knew obviously that David was from Shevet Yehuda on his father's side, but not only that, Shevet Yehuda itself was divided into two branches. There was Peretz and Zorach. And the difference between the two is that Peretz was designated for Malchus. The ultimate king of Israel would come from Peretz. And we'll see that in the name Peretz. Whereas the other branch, which is Zorach, they will be Chashuvim, but not Malchus. There's no Malchus coming from the descendants of Zorach, only from the descendants of Peretz. And that's indicated by the name Peretz. Sheporetz lo derech. Again, there's a great machlokas here what that means. But be that as it may, if necessary, under certain conditions, the king is allowed to take over the possessions of an ordinary citizen, and he can tell him, you have to relocate. I'm going to be plowing a highway here through your land, through your property. He's allowed to do that. That's called Peretz. Sheporetz lo derech. Now, at this point, Avner is very confused. He doesn't know generations back where David comes from. Ben Mizah, meaning Ben, going back, is he from Peretz or Zorah? At this point, enter stage Doeg. It's a very unique sugya where the Gemara goes through a long piece in Tanakh, a history, one step at a time. Doeg, who's one of the heads of Sanhedrin, comes forward and he says to Shaul, you're asking about whether David is designated for Malchus because he comes on his father's side from Peretz. You should be asking a more fundamental question. Is he Roy Lovell Akal? He, on his mother's side, is a descendant from Ruth HaMoaviyah, about which the Torah says, Lo Yovel B'Kal Hashem. The Torah says, Lo Yovo Mamzer B'Kal Hashem, or Torah says about Mitzri for 3 generations. There are many categories of Psulei Kol. And one of them is Ammon and Moab. And this, as we said before, was already the fear in the heart of Yishai when he wanted to leave his wife and marry a Shivcha Knainis. Comes along Avner, and again, I have to assume that Avner was a shtickle Talmid Chacham. He wasn't on the Sanhedrin. He was a military guy. He had what we call in Israel falafels, and he questions Doeg, and he says, "Wait a minute, Doeg, are you not aware of the drasha of Ammon v'lo Ammonis, Moab v'lo Moavis?" And to this, Doeg responds, "That's not a fair drasha. If anyone tried to pass along that drasha to you, he was just confusing you." When the Torah uses a masculine word to describe a nation, that's just the Lashon HaTorah. It doesn't mean that we're excluding a woman. And if you are excluding a woman, what are you going to do with the Torah in Mamzer that says, Lo Yovo Mamzer B'Kal Hashem? What are you going to do with the Mitzri when it says, Adar Shlishi, a Mitzri Lo Yovo, etc.? Obviously, the word Mitzri or the word Mamzer includes even the female members. So let's apply the same yardstick to Ammon and Moab. And when it says Ammoni, it means either a male or a female member of Ammon. When it says Moavi, male or female. So Avner says the following: "You're right, Rabbi Doeg. I'm worried about you. You're really giving us a convincing argument. But, here's the royal but. This is the one case, Ammon and Moab, where the Torah actually gives the reasoning for the psul to exclude them. In fact, the Torah gives 2 reasons, both of which seem to apply to Moab, or at least one of them applies to Moab, the other applies to Ammon. But this sugya seems to assume that both of these reasons apply to Moab. They were excluded because, as the Torah says, "Bidvar asher lo kidmu oschem belechem ubemayim baloschem b'Mitzrayim," when we were starving and very thirsty, 600,000 strong, and we were coming out of Mitzrayim into the desert, and any decent people would have brought out lechem umayim, and they didn't do so. They're cruel. We cannot let a genetically cruel nation enter into Klal Yisrael, marry our Jewish girls. Furthermore, Sachar Aleim is Bilam, right? It was Moab that, right, Balak and Moab that paid off Bilam to curse the Jewish people. Look at this cruelty. We don't want them to enter into the pillar. So the Torah gives us the reasoning. Usually we don't speculate. Yeah, I've seen like bris milah. I've seen 15 answers to why bris milah. But at the end of the day, it's just exeris hakos. The Torah commanded us in the midst of bris milah. But this is an exceptional case because the Torah itself tells us why we're excluding Ammon and Moab. Comes along Avner and he says the following: Lo kidmu eskem belechem umayim. That doesn't apply to the female members of Ammon and Moab. Let's focus on Moab. They can hide under the following shield. Oh, shield. I just bumped into okay, anyway. But so what's the shield that protects the Moaviyah? It's the fact that Ein Darko Shel Isha Lekadem. A woman doesn't go out there and bring food like lechem umayim to another nation, in this case, and Asher lo kidmu eschem doesn't apply to the women. Now, it's very interesting, by the way. I don't have an answer to this question. If you can help me with this as a footnote on the side. The Gemara is telling us that we cannot fault the Bnos Moab because they're very modest women. We know about the modesty, so to speak, in inverted commas, of the Bnos Moab. I mean, they were responsible to bring down the whole nation because they were immodesty. But in any event, this is their claim. They lo kidmu eschem ein darka shalisha lekade.
We asked that, and somebody asked that in Shir. They said that it was the Midyanim women, not the Moabite women. And Ammon wasn't even part of that, no?
I think Midyan gave the eitzah to Moab, but the actual znus was with the Bnos Moab.
It wasn't.
So these were not modest women to say that they weren't Makadim Esther. The eitzah came from Midyan, came from Bilam. So now we have the following scenario. Doeg gets up and he challenges Avner. And he says, yeah, you might be right. Maybe the women folk of Moab were so modest, we can't fault them for not going out and bringing bread and water for the Jewish soldiers. I mean, they weren't even soldiers at that time. But why didn't they bring out bread and water for the women folk? They were suffering so much from starvation, lack of thirst. Where's your decency? Apparently, the Bnos Moab were equally immoral. They were cruel people. And at that point, everything goes haywire. Because that argument of Doeg had no counter argument. And now Avner is stumped. He doesn't have an answer. And the Gemara tells us that at this moment in time, they were about to notify the public from the rooftops that David is excluded from Klal Yisrael because he's a descendant of Ruth HaMoaviyah. Now, it's interesting. The Tanakh records that at this point, Shaul addresses Avner, and he says, Ben mi zeh ha'elem. Elem is a young man, but if you remember what we wrote on the blackboard before, it was Ben nar zeh ben mi. Now it's an elem. Why change the word? And Chazal say that elem is liloshan helem, and it's alma mimcha v'eni yodeh leparsha. You do not know, Avner, how to interpret this parsha. And what is the status of David? Go, says Shaul, into the Beis Medrash and find out what's the status of the descendant of a Moaviyah, which Avner does. And he comes to the Beis Medrash and he gets the following response, which has been passed on for over generations from the time of Boaz. Ammon v'lo Ammonis, Moab v'lo Moavis. So Avner asks him all the kashas. Back and forth, the same shaka v'tarya, until finally he asks the kash of Doeg, hoyel lehem lekadem anoshim lekras anoshim, noshim lekras noshim. And at that point, the Beis Medrash fell silent. They did not know the answer to this question. V'rotzu lahachris olav al David shu pasol Yosef. And now, who comes center stage? Amsa ben Yeser, who was the son-in-law of Yishai, and he stands there like Lahavdil Arafat in the United Nations, with his all his bullets there, and this guy Amsa is holding on to a cherev, and he declares, "Kol mi she'eino shomer la'halacha zu yidakter b'cherev." That's one way of getting your point across. And then he adds, Kach mekublani mi beis dino shel Shmuel Aramosi. I have a Kabbalah from the Beis Din of Shmuel. The Rambam in his introduction to his great Chibur, Mishnah Torah, mentions amongst the 40 links in the Masorah, the Beis Din of Shmuel Hanavi. Kach mekublani miveistiro shel Shmuel Aramasi Amon v'lo Amoni v'lo Amonis Moavi v'lo Moavis. So don't ask me kashas about Hoyel Lahem Lekadim Es Hanoshim. This is the drasha. The Gemara says, but still, what about Avner's Taina? So the Gemara says, Kol Kvuda Bas Melech Pnima, Shalom says in Mishlei, it's the modesty of the women is to stay inside. Again, one wonders about the modesty of the Bnos Moab. They were inside the tents seducing the Jewish men. And they made deals with them, to worship the idols. But in any event, all right, we found in the Gemara some sort of a hair's breadth of a justification for why the Bnos Moavi are not guilty, shelo kadem kidem es hanosh. The Gemara offers a second answer in the name of our Rav of the Eretz Yisrael Dikkers. And when the Malachim come to visit Sarah Imenu, Vayomer lo ayeh Sarah ishtecha, Vayomru hinei ba'oel. Sarah is in the oil. That's called modesty, that a married woman is in the oil. So Moab stayed in the oil, the Bnos Moab. And they were fulfilling this requirement of Sarah Imenu hinei ba'oel.
The Malachim were men.
And therefore, I didn't catch the.
How can you say Kol Kvuda? Now, there's a whole question was from why the women didn't go out to the women. By saying Sarah stayed in the tent when the Malachim came, that's no riot to anything.
Well, again,
if the Malachim were women, or if there were women with the Malachim, then you could say, why didn't Sarah come out and serve the women?
No, I don't think, Bobby, that's what the Gemara means. The Gemara is only saying that Sarah Imenu becomes the paradigm for modesty of women. Why? Because she's always in the oil. It has nothing to do with the fact that there were men outside. Just the Torah went out of its way for all eternity to let us know Hine Ba'oel. And the Hine Ba'oel is a message for all eternity. All right. In any event, at this point, David is reinstituted into Klal Yisrael. Back and forth, back and forth. Now he's considered a kosher, Ruth, and her conversion is to be recognized. Now I want to ask you the following question. The Gemara says, Kol Kvuda Bas Melech Pnima, and it refers to even the Bnos Moab. So what do we do with this description of the Bnos Moab to apply this pasuk in Mishlei to the Bnos Moab? So if you take a look on page 361, he quotes the Marshal. And the Marshal writes that the pasuk of Kol Kvuda Bas Melech Pnima really refers to Bnos Yisrael. And he says the following. This is what we call in Yiddish a vitz. He says that the reason why the Bnos Moab were not at fault is because the Bnos Yisrael were in the oil. Kol Kvuda Bas Melech Pnima. And therefore they weren't even approaching the Moab people for lechem umayim. Interesting vitz. Okay. Now we get to the second part of this episode of Megilas Ruth. So until now, we were learning Shmuel Aleph, and we are focused on Perek Tezayin, Perek Yud Zayin. Now we're focused on Megilas Ruth. there was an individual who was a closer relative to the family of Elimelech and so forth. His name was Ploni Almoni. That itself is an interesting question. Why the Tanakh omits or conceals his name? Fine. Number two, if Ploni Almoni is a closer relative, then when Boaz wants to marry Ruth and hopefully fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum because he believes that Ruth is a full-fledged Giores, then he has to turn first to the closer kin, which he does, and he gives the Ploni Almoni first dibs at marrying Ruth. So the Ploni Almoni says the following in the last chapter of Ruth. Says, Lo uchal ligo, the geula here is the act of Yibum. Pen ashchis es nachlosi. Rashi says nachlosi means zari. And he quotes a pasuk to prove that. So in other words, this Ploni Almoni was convinced that if he marries Ruth, his children will be psulei kol, meaning he never accepted the drasha, and many didn't, until Boaz tried to publicize the drasha in front of this Canaan of Moavi v'lo Moavis. How can I marry Ruth? The Torah doesn't recognize her gerus. She's a Moaviyah. And Chazal tell us that this Ploni Almoni was in truth ignorant. Ilaim haya b'divrei Torah. He said, this is the Ploni Almoni, Rishonim lo mesu ela b'shvil shenotlu osa. In fact, Boaz, the very night that he consummated the Yibum with Ruth, he died. What does that mean? Is that not a remez, some sort of sign? Ani elech v'tlenoli? Look how many people died from that same woman called Ruth and other women from Moab. So all of Beis Elimelech was wiped out. Why? Because they married Moavios. Anima Arif Sul de Bonai? I'm going to go ahead and again introduce into my Banim Psulei Kol. Again, the literal translation, he didn't know about this drasha, but more likely he didn't accept that drasha because many did not accept the drasha. You remember that Doeg, for example, later on, generations later, is going to ask so many kashas on this drasha. And now we introduce the Targum. It's on the bottom of page 361. On the pasuk, again here in the 4th chapter of Ruth, Hagod Hugadli, which means that Boaz is announcing that he found out what a great woman this Ruth is, says the Targum, Hugadli b'divrei chachamim, shekasher gazar Hashem ala mo'avim lo gazar l'nekevos, el ala gvarim bilvad. V'nemar li shasidim lotzeis mimech Malachim Unavir. And Boaz was absolutely convinced, based on this, shall we say, Ruach HaKodesh, and he goes ahead and he gathers together Asar Anoshim Yiziknei Ha'ir to be Mefarsem, the halacha of Moab v'lo Moavis. Says the Malbim, Boaz was a chacham. Boaz knew that he's got to be mora halacha before it's relevant to him. Kol Talmid Chacham shemora halacha shelo haisa yidu lechaveirav kodem lechein. If a maisa comes liyodo and he wants to introduce or implement a leniency, we're not going to accept his testimony when he says that my Rebbeim taught me so-and-so. He's what you call an Ogeh B'Eidos Posel. So Boaz says the Malbim was a big chacham. So what he did was he gathered together 10 people of the Ziknei Ha'ir to publicize the drasha of Moavi v'lo Moavis before he would take the Ploni Almoni and challenge him, would you be miyabim Rus? So that his testimony would be accepted and the drasha would be transmitted from one generation to the other. So now that Boaz publicized this halacha in the name of his Rebbeim, now he turns to the Ploni Almoni and he says to him, what's the deal here? Are you willing to be miyabim? So it's very interesting that he didn't even talk to the Ploni Almoni before he met with this Canaan, because he wanted to make sure that he wasn't an Ogeh B'Tov. Okay, fine. On the bottom of 362, he quotes an interesting insight of the Vilna Gaon. He says, no, I'm sorry. This is not Rev Eliyov Vilna. Okay, fine. He says, Gam zos osa Boaz b'shvil hashis halacha pirsei v'lana v'gam esrus hamoaviyah Eshes machlon kanisi li isha v'yikach Boaz esrus v'atilo li isha. And the pasuk goes out of its way to describe Ruth as a Moaviyah, again to emphasize that she is mutar b'kal Yisrael because of the drasha of Moavi v'lo Moavis. Now, at this point, I'm just worried about the clock. So there's a lot of great stuff here on page 360, 364. And if we have time, we'll come back to it. Let's fast forward to 364. And this, I think, is the punchline of our discussion today. Just going to make a note of what we skipped. Okay. We are now about to learn a chiddush of the Brisker Rav in Tanakh. Very rare. And this is one of the most famous chidushim of the Brisker Rav in Tanakh, here in Megilat Ruth. And it's going to open our eyes as to why the Minig B'Yisrael is to read Megilat Ruth on truths. Although that's not his agenda. He doesn't understand why this Ploni Almoni is saying, Pen ashchis es nachlos. Excuse me. He's worried about his children, that they will be excluded from Kal Yisrael. Because again, he doesn't have the drasha permitting a Moaviyah. Why, asks the Brisker Rav, is he concerned about his children? Why isn't he concerned about himself? He is enjoined from marrying Ruth Lishitaso. Why does he have to mention his children? And then he adds another kasha, that's one in the name of the Bach. He should have said, when he turns to Boaz and he says, Ga'alacha, in other words, I'm, so to speak, removing myself from the mitzvah of Yibum, you now do Yibum. Why does he turn to Boaz to say, you do Yibum? He should have said, Lo ani, v'lo ata, rashayim ligalosa. And then the Brisker Rav adds a third catch. Who's this Amsa ben Yeser? Who does he think he is? Kach mekublani mibeis dino shel Shmuel haramasi, Moav v'lo Moavis. And he is a big shot. He's going to be machriya the halacha. I mean, Avner already quoted this price of this halacha. And yet Doeg did not accept this halacha. So what does Amsa gain here? Okay, great. Furthermore, this halacha of V'lo Moavis dates back to Boaz. This is generations before David HaMelech. This was already accepted in front of the Asaras Kedim. Why would we now question that halacha? There's the Brisker Rav, based on the Rambam, that there's a concept called Kabbalah LeMoshe Misinai. And that concept should be contrasted with what we call the Midos Shatorah Nidreshes. And there's a fundamental difference between the two. If you derive a halacha from the Midos Shatorah Nidreshes, and we have a principle of Bezdin Acher Yochel Levatil as Bezdin Chaveros. The Gadol Bimenu, the Chachmu V'Minyan, the Gemara at the beginning of Beta, they can override a decision made by an earlier Bezdin. But Kabbalah L'Moshe Misinai Eino Mishtanem Lo Lamis. And the Rambam writes at the beginning of Hilchos Mamrim, Divrei Kabbalah Ein shum bezdin yachol lachlok alav. Ein shum bezdin yachol lachlok alav, Rabbi. So do you hear that? It's not a question of gadol emenu bechachmu v'minyan. Says the Brisker Rav, this halacha of v'lo moaviyah, where does it belong? How do you categorize it? We know that Boaz publicized this halacha. Good. But so what? The Ploni Almoni thought that that was an analysis of the parsha of Ammon and Moav based on the Midos HaTorah Nidreshes plan. And, you know, the Moavios were not included. It says Moavi, and they wouldn't be Makadem the Nashim, blah, 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 the whole 9 months. So that's why Ploni Almoni is afraid that even if the Bezdin at the time of Boaz accepted this drasha, excluding the Moavi from the exclusion, a Bezdin later on down the line could overturn that decision. He's not worried about himself. Yeshlo mi lismo. He can be somech on the Bezdin of Boaz. No one could fault him for marrying Ruth. He's not going to fault Boaz for marrying Ruth either. He's worried about his children and his grandchildren down the line when at some point a Bezdin will come to overrule the decision of the earlier Bezdin at the time of Boaz and passel his zera. That's nachlos. That's what he's worried about. And Ashchis es nachlos. Comes along Boaz, and he says the following. Not Boaz, I'm sorry. Comes along Amsa, and he says the following. Kach mikublani mi bezdino shel Shmuel. This is not a matter of HaTorah nidreshes b'yud gimel midos nidreshes ben HaTorah mikublani mi bezdino shel Shmuel. This is halacha l'Moshe Sinai that was passed down through the generations till Bezdin shel Shmuel authorized this and canonized it as halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There is no Bezdin ever that can overrule that decision and that principle. And it's amazing. And we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to our chaver, Rabbi Yitzchak Mirsky Shlita, for quoting the Smag I never know how Rav Mursky gets all these Mar Makayvus. It's unbelievable. So in the middle of page 366, he quotes the Smag, who in turn quotes one of the great Rishonim, who says that Hascharim afilu b'nei amad sof kol adoros asurim lisa Yisraelis aval anekevos mutaros miyad kishar umos v'chein kiblu mibezdin shel Shmuel Aramasi v'hu, meaning Shmuel, kibel davar zeh halacha l'Moshe v'Sinai. The Goel thought that Boaz, if he would marry Ruth, would be relying on a Torah dresses pen, on a Midosh Torah dresses pen, and he better be careful about a later Besdin. But in truth, that's not what was going on over here. When Boaz was Goel Ruth, he was relying on what Yisro was telling him, that this is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, an unbroken chain that was handed down through Shmuel and Navi. I'm only perplexed about one question, if you can help me this. Shmuel was still alive at the time. He wrote this book. I don't know why they have to go through all this, cherev, weigh my bullets over your head. I mean, just go. Why did they just, send a Facebook message to Shmuel and Navi? I don't know. That I don't understand. But in any event, comes along the Brisker Rav, and he says that this is the essence of the Eidus of Amsa ben Yeser, Kach Mekublani, etc. And this has nothing to do with the Mishnah that Avner was quoting and that Doeg was debating, because the entire debate comes to a standstill once we establish that this halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And if this be the case, Rabosa, we begin to understand why Shmuel wrote the book of Ruth. Because Shmuel used this as a way of eternalizing and immortalizing the halacha of Moab v'lo Moavis. And what's at stake over here? It's at stake over here is Mashiach ben David. And Shmuel is telling us that if you read between the lines, what's going on here is that the Ploni Almoni is not even going to be mentioned by name. Forget about him. And there's no doubt in my mind that Shmuel deliberately omitted his name, because he made a major mistake that could have undermined the entire essence of Malchus Shel Mashiach. And really, Boaz was the one who understood. And Chazal and Torah Shebal Peh fill in the blanks because of the Kach Mekublani of Hamsa, that this was halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and no one could ever have the chutzpah to debate it and question it. And we might add that Shmuel HaNavi was the one who anointed David HaMelech as Melech. So obviously, he wants it to be crystal clear that David HaMelech can serve as the king, and he could enter into Klal Yisrael. And he's not a descendant of someone who's excluded on the P'sulei Kol. He is a descendant of Ruth HaMoaviyah, whose gerus is absolutely reliable, impeccable, unquestionable. And there's a commentary on Megilas Ruth written by Reb Shlomo Alkabetz. We know Alkabetz from the Chadodi. What about his Pirush on Megilas Ruth? That we don't know. He says, Hani Omer, Shezeh Sefer, Klolo Uprato, Nichtav, Lahachshir as David Olav Shalom, Ulaharos Shemoaviyah, Shero Lavo Bekal, V'hu Psak Din Mishmuel HaNavi, Lahasir Lazus Vasayim El David Mishichenu. And that's why it's included in Kisvei HaKodesh. This is a Psak Din that's written between the lines in Megilas Ruth. Lahachshir as David, V'malchus Beis David, V'melech HaMashiach Ad Olam. And you'll ask, why didn't they just write the Psak Din? Ilu Haya Psak Din Nichtav Levado, Haya Chashash Shahaya Nifsad B'meshech hazman v'oved. He doesn't tell you why. Why would this psak din be overruled with time? The answer is that people would think this is not Shmuel's psak din. This is a psak din of whoever thought that this is the way you wanted darshan the parsha. And later on, they're going to overrule that decision. And furthermore, lo dia sheksav kosher zeh shekosav Shmuel hu amitis, and it has the same status as Shar Kisvei HaKodesh. We don't question it. It was authored by Shmuel HaNavi. It's reliable. And it's so fascinating that he called the name of his commentary on Megilat Ruth Shoresh Yishai, the roots or the origins of Yishai. That was the name of his chibur on the Megillah. If we could only take a time machine back 5 centuries to the city of Tzfat and sit there with Rav Shlomo Alkovitz, could you imagine? And he's telling us, I'm going to write a commentary called Shoresh Yishai on Megilat Ruth, because the entire essence of Megilat Ruth and the reason it was written by Shmuel and incorporated Tanakh is to establish the Shoresh of Yishai. It's too bad that this Sefer of Shmuel was not extant at the time of Yishai, because then he wouldn't have had to marry a Shivcha Knainis. Okay. We only have a few minutes left, but what I'd like to do is go back to the 2 pages that we skipped.
Just one question, Berzon.
Yeah, please.
So when you say Halacha Moshe Sinai, it's not really Sinai, right? Because the whole story happened after Sinai with the Moavim.
So I don't understand if it happened after Sinai. Oh, you mean? I see what you're saying.
It's not really Halacha Moshe Sinai.
Yeah, but
Halacha, I mean,
I think that
ideas.
Yeah. No, I think that, again, I'm not a Bucky here. I can take out the encyclopedia, look up Halacha Moshe Sinai. But many of the mitzvahs HaTorah and many of what was taught to Moshe Rabbeinu was anticipating what would happen down the line. In any event, he has a kasha from the Maharsha. We're back on page 363, where we skipped. What was the suffix of Doeg Hadomi, whether David should be kosher l'kol or not kosher l'kol? The Gemara says that Boaz had, this Gemara Ksubis, had already gathered together Asor Miziknei ear, and he publicized the halacha of Moavi v'lo Moavis. And furthermore, the Maharsha adds another kasha here. What about Boaz himself, who marries Ruth HaMoivah? I mean, is he suspect, according to Doeg, of having violated an Isur Chitun with Psulei Kol? And furthermore, how could Doeg think that the Ploni Almoni, how could the Ploni Almoni think that he's such a big shot that he could argue against Boaz, who is a Shofet B'Yisrael? Says the Maharsha, fascinating. Yevama Asura Mishum Psulei Chitun B'Lav. Kigon Shehi Mamzeres. Okay, here we have to know more of Masech Yevamis. Do we apply Esei Dochalosis and Yibum or not? At this point, the Maharsha is assuming that Esei Dochalosas. In the case of an Almana, let's say a Kohen Hedjot marries a woman, right? And she's an Almana, which he's allowed to marry, and then he dies, and his brother's the Kohen Gadol. So the Almana now falls for even the Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara has, at least according to Habib, I don't know the Maskana, you have to see the Sugis, that it wasn't that the older brother, the deceased brother, was Makadesh, the Almana. He was no Seyas Almana. It means he consummated the marriage. And as a result of consummating the marriage, this woman is no longer a Basula, she's an Almana. A Ba'ula. And therefore, in this case, the mitzvah of Yibum would have to override not only the lav of Almana L'Kohen Gadol, but also the Isha B'Psulei Yikar. Okay, I don't know. You have to really know the answer to this question. The Gemara at the beginning of Masechet Yibum seems to assume that we're not going to apply Hesed Dochalos in Yibum because there's a possibility of Chalita. You have to make order and Seder out of this whole sugi. But the Maharsha is assuming Hesed Dochalos. The Esafali question. Let's say, in the worst case scenario, that Rus has the status of Psulei Kol. That's only a law. And therefore, if there's a mitzvah of Yibum, we should apply the principle of Hesed Dochalos Asa. Fine. So he says the following. Again, it's also a sugi in Yevamos, that the mitzvah of Yibum only applies for the first bia. After the first bia, when the Yavam has already fulfilled his obligation, his mitzvah of Yibum, then it's up to him. He can decide to maintain the marriage or he can divorce her. Some want to say that maybe there's no longer an Hesed Dochalos. Again, very complicated sugyas that you have to know. It's not for Daf Yom. Anyway, he says the following. Let's say the Yavama is Asura on the Yavam with an Isur Lav, like the case of Mamzeres. If Mamzeres falls for Yibum, so then we have a problem of Hesed Dochalos. He says the following. The mitzvah of Yibum would only be matir the first bia. And we would apply the principle of Yavo Esei Shel Yibum, V'yidcha lo saseh de Mamzeres. Okay, now he was already Makayim, the mitzvah of Yibum with the first bia. There's no mitzvah of Yibum on the second bia. What's going to override the Isur Mamzeres? In this case, the Rabbanan might step in and say, let's make a gzera. We're going to suspend the operation of Hesed Dochalos Asa because we're afraid that from Bia Rishona, he might go to Bia Shnia, where there's no Hesed Dochalos Asa. So the Ramban writes that there was a mitzvah of Yibum that dates back as early as the time of Yehuda and Tamar and all of the those individuals who married into that family. And this was before Matan Torah. And they knew already then that there was a great toelis in the mitzvah of Yibum, even though the mitzvah of Yibum wasn't given until Har Sinai. And therefore, Roy Leos, Kodem, V'achrov HaKorov B'mishpach. So anyone who's the close relative would understand that there's a pressing need for Yibum, even though, again, at that time the Torah wasn't given yet. And Kol She'ero HaKorov Elu Mishpachto, anyone who is a Yoresh, an heir, and is close, he would be Mekayim, mitzvah of Yibum. Again, technically it's not a mitzvah of Yibum because the mitzvah wasn't given yet. And Zeu Inyan Boaz V'tam Nomi Vashchenos. Says the Maharsha, Doeg and the Goel were of the opinion that the fact that Boaz would marry Ruth would not in any way prove a thing, because they understood that Ammon and Moav, which included even a Moavis, are prohibited, and Boaz would marry Ruth because of the mitzvah of Yibum. Again, we're assuming that Machlon had already converted Rus before he married her. Otherwise, there's no mitzvah of Yibum here to be Mekayim Shmo Shel Machlon by marrying Rus. But the marriage to Rus was valid because of the gerus of Rus. Okay. Now, even if I assume, as we called it, the worst case scenario, that a Moavia is Asur B'lav, the essay of Yibum should be Dochalos Asa. Now you're going to tell me, well, wait a minute, there's a Gzera D'Rabbana, where Atu be a Rishon, Atu be a Shnia. No, Lo Ovar al Gzera D'Rabbana, Kevan should be a Meim Adayin Lo Gozu be a Rishon, Atu be a Shnia. Says the Maharsha, an amazing chiddush, that historically, at the time of Boaz, they hadn't yet instituted this zera. However, Zaro Yeh Apostle, Tarei below Yibum, Mo'avis Asura, Vabodim Holchim Achrei Apostle. So although this could be a heter for Boaz, it's not going to be a heter for their offspring, because there's no longer a mitzvah of Yibum. And there's nothing to override the Isur Psulei Kol of Moavis. So therefore, Doeg Adomi thought that David was possible. He was Psulei Kol. It's really amazing. Boaz had the heter to marry Ruth, mi mitzvahs Yibum, to override the Los Haseh of Psulei Kol. But already when we get to the generation afterwards, let's say 4 generations later, how many generations are there? 4 until David is born? I forget. There's Oved, and let's say 3 generations later. So David HaMelech is born. Now he comes from apostle. And there's no mitzvah of Yibum to be doche the law. So let's say, for example, Yishai has a relationship with one of the offspring of Ruth. Then there's no mitzvah of Yibum in this case, and therefore, we're going to end up with a psul. So now what we have in the Maharsha, and this will summarize and wrap it up for today, is that according to Maharsha, we can answer some of the Brisker Rav's questions. Right? The Brisker Rav was wondering, A, why Doeg was worried about his zera and not about himself. B, why did he turn to Boaz and say to Boaz, you be Mekayim the mitzvah of Goel. And additionally, who is this guy Doeg? What kind of chutzpah? I mean, already generations earlier, Boaz was matir. Says the Maharsha, Boaz was matir for himself because he had the mitzvah of Yibum in the case of Ruth, based on the assumption that Machlon was Megaya Ruth. But that mitzvah of Yibum would only be matir Bia Rishona. So Boaz dies after Bia Rishona, and there's no problem of overriding the Psulei Kol. But generations down the line, there's going to be Psulei Kol. David HaMelech is going to be born from the lineage of Ruth HaMoaviyah, and we never accepted the halacha of Moavi, Lo Moaviyah. And therefore, David is going to be Psulei Kol. When it comes to the Yibum of Ruth, so they turn to the Ploni Almoni and they say, you be Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum. He's not worried about himself. He's only worrying about his zera, which was the Brisker Rav's kasha. The Maharsha, 4.5 centuries earlier, answered that kasha. He said the reason why Ploni Almoni is not worried about himself is because he's going to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum. The same means why Boaz is not asking that question. But we still are left with the Isur Psulei Kol of Moaviyah, and that's going to impact on generations to come. Pen Ashkis es Nachlos. That's the Maharsha.
Questions?
Okay, you know what? I'm going to just take 1 minute, of a little break. Just got to get just give me 60 seconds. Yeah. Just going to open the window here. I'm in a very stuffy room here. Yeah, I'm back with you.
Feeling okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. It's just that it's hard for me to explain what it means to teach an hour on Zoom. This is the 6th year I'm giving today. That's after Hanetz, and I have a chavrusa before Hanetz. So at some point, I have to take a little bit of a breather,
But
Yeah,
you're an
go ahead.
hour and 10 minutes in.
As long as it's only 60 seconds.
So just first of all, I would ask, Roberto, you said that once you know the Brisker Rav, you'll understand why we lay Megilat Ruth on Shavuos.
Oh, I didn't get back to that. Thank you so much. because that's in the second half of this essay, which we didn't even get to. According to many of the Mefarshim, the celebration of Shavuos is somewhat of a challenge. Why? Because we read the Aseret HaDibros, which is Torah Shebechsav. We read the Maftir and the Karbonos Hayom and Shtei Alechem and the whole bit, Yom HaBikurim. But where's Torah Shebal Peh? It seems to be totally absent. And that's a problem because Kabbalas HaTorah on Shavuos requires a double Kabbalah, not just Torah Shebechsav, but also Torah Shebal Peh. The reading of Megillas Ruth is going to fill in that blank because the entire story of Boaz and eventually of David HaMelech and defeating, the Ploni Almoni, defeating the Doeg Hadomi, and all that is all based on Torah Shebal Peh. It's Halacha LeMoshe Sinai, which is the apex and paradigm of Torah Shebal Peh. So the Chazal organized an integration between the readings of Torah Shebechsav and Megillas Ruth, which represent totally Torah Shebal Peh. We said that in the name of the Alshich, the entire Megillah was written in order to establish this Halacha LeMoshe Sinai of the Bezdin of Shmuel of Lo Moaviyah. And the entire episode of Mashiach and his ancestry from as a descendant of David is all based on Torah Shebal Peh. So if you take a look, for example, I don't know exactly what page it is. The second, it should be page 369. Why is it that the Torah didn't tell us what day of the month is Shavuos? And the answer is, it's all to teach us that Mimachras HaShabbos is not the way that Stukim understood it when they were totally and exclusively committed to Torah Shebechsav, but rather the way the Prushim, who thank God won this battle, interpreted Mimachras HaShabbos. We begin counting on the day after the first day of Pesach, on the 16th of Nisan, and we count 50 days, and then we sanctify that day of 50 as Chag HaShavuos. It's all based on Torah Shebal Peh. The very essence of the holiday of Shavuos equals Torah Shebal Peh, Mimachras HaShabbos. Had the Torah just told us what day, let's say the 6th of Sivan, that would be Torah Shebechsav. But that wouldn't reflect on the essence of Shavuos. And again, a thought occurred to me again, this is Lo Hoya V'Lo Nivra, but, we blow a shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and at Kabbalas HaTorah, they blew the shofar. What's the connection between the two? I think it's Rav Sajid Gaon already pointed out that the shofar of Rosh Hashanah is connected the shofar of Kabbalas HaTorah, which is connected the shofar of Mashiach. So that David HaMelech, as the father of Mashiach, and as the, let's say, prime persona of Megillas Ruth, is really a connection to the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, of Malchus, but in this case of Malchus Melech HaMashiach. And again, I was thinking crazy thoughts. We have a minhag of eating milchiks on Shavuos. Many different explanations for that. But one of the explanations is to publicly implement the Gzeira D'Rabbanan of Basa V'Chala. And we'll end a milchik meal, and whatever you need to do after milchik meal to end it, maybe you have to brush your teeth, kinuach hapeh, maybe you have to do what's called hadochas hapeh, and maybe even birkas hamazon, but hopefully not. But that's the machlokas. And then you bang on the table and you say, bring out the basa, because the Torah says, "V'samachta b'chagecha in simcha b'basa." This is all to emphasize Torah Shebal Peh. The Torah Shebechsav says, don't take a gedi and cook it in the milk of its mother. And now you're telling me I can't eat my cheese balinces together with my London broil. Oh, this is a million light years away from the Torah Shebechsav to the Torah Shebal Peh. But on the day of Kabbalah Satorah, it's more important than any other day of the year. Okay, by you, it's going to be 2 days, fine. You'll have Shabbos, Sunday, and Monday. We got away easy here with the Shabbos and a Sunday. But you're going to be declaring is that my Kabbalah Satorah is not just Torah Shebechsav. Torah Shebechsav could have led me to a different day based on the Tzdukim. And not only that, I'm not going to eat milchiks and fleishiks in the same meal based on Torah Shebal Peh. And not only that, there's going to be a Mashiach, and Kabbalah Satorah means blow the shofar of Mashiach, and that Mashiach is going to be the descendant of David because of Torah Shebal Peh, because of the drasha, which is Halacha Moshe Sinai Beis Dino Shel Shmuel established it, and the book of Ruth was written to in order to establish the Halacha Moshe Sinai of Moavi v'lo Moaviyah. And therefore Boaz could marry Ruth, and David HaMelech is not Psulei Kol, and hence we have Mashiach ben David. Should be Zocher with Hashem to learn Tanakh the way that we learned the Megillas Ruth as a combination of Torah Shebechsav with Torah Shebal Peh. We live in a generation, I don't know if you see it there in the, in all those motions over there. And, it's all about Torah Shebechsav. We get these great Tanakh teachers from, okay, I don't want to mention the yeshiva because one of my rebbeim was the Rosh Yeshiva there, so I don't want to say, but, it's all about Torah Shebechsav, and they have all the literary, blah, 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 the ABCs and all the dos and yens, and we know how to interpret the Torah Shebechsav. And my Rebbe was not happy with it. It was going the wrong way. But we have an integration of Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. We should be zocher to understand and appreciate that integration.
Amen. Is Megillas Ruth Torah Shebechsav or Torah Shebal Peh?
Torah Shebechsav.
Okay, so.
But the Torah Shebechsav of Megillas Ruth can only be understood with Torah Shebal Peh. If you don't have the Torah Shebal Peh, the Sugin Yavamis, and the Medrash that we spoke about, and the Brisker Rav, and before that, the Marsha, and so forth and so on, everything that we discussed today. If you don't have that, then Megillas Ruth is a closed book. You're stuck with the question of Moaviyah, and how could Boaz marry Ruth? The whole Megillah is called Megillas Ruth. And it's all about Boaz marrying Ruth. And it's all about David HaMelech at the end of the Megillah, who was born from that marriage. Why? She's a Moaviyah. You got to have the Amsa there, with the Cherev and the announcement that Kach Mekublani Beis Dino Shel Shmuel Halacha Moshe Sinai, as the Rasag says it, Moavi v'lo Moavi.
Now you understand, Bobby, why the Rav had to take a minute.
Okay then. All right, call too. Thank you so much.
Okay. Have a good day, everybody.